Can you hear me, Steve? It's too loud, no? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hello? 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 Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you. Okay.
Feels like every time I'm walking through spaces, like
Sounds good.
groups with the same people, like different people. It's lovely. But thank you for.
Oh, my pleasure. Absolutely. So give me a signal when you want me to start. They're not panels for me, so they're waiting for the panels to finish.
Yeah, yeah, no hurry. Yeah.
Shouldn't be. Good afternoon. I'm Ann Pyburn. I'm local talent from the IU Anthropology Department. And I have the great pleasure, delight of introducing and embarrassing my colleague and friend, Eduardo Brondizio. Here at IU, he is Distinguished Professor of Anthropology, Senior Fellow at the Ostrom Workshop, and Director of the Center for Analysis of Social Ecological Landscapes. He's on advisory boards for the Nature Conservancy, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the U.S. National Center for Environmental Conflict Resolution, Environment and Climate Change Canada, Conabio, Mexico, ICOMOS UNESCO, and the Center for Sustainability Studies at the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Brazil. In 2023, he won the Volvo Environmental Prize from the Swedish Academy of Science. In 2022, after he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences, he was elected Fellow of the International Science Council of France. I'm not listing the editorial advisory boards he's on or the research grants he's been awarded. I will note that he is currently curator of a museum exhibit that's now on display at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology that's on the other side of campus from where we are right now, and which you should all visit if you possibly can. Our Indigenous curator, Brandy McDonald, has brilliantly foregrounded a Native perspective in the museum that makes it quite unique. Eduardo's publications are literally legion. I quit counting at 300. In these papers, he examines interactions among development policies, markets, climate change, and household and community level collective action, land use change and migration. His work for Indigenous Amazonians has focused on threats to territorial governance, analyzing the pressures to Indigenous areas as they co-evolve with agricultural frontiers, mining, and urban expansion. In fact, I could take up the whole time allotted for his talk, just listing his accomplishments and describing his research, but instead I'm going to tell you what I think is most important about him in the context of these meetings on global Indigenous studies. As a scientist, Dr. Brondizio's work seeks to engage, elevate, collaborate with, and serve Indigenous peoples of the Amazon. As a scholar, Eduardo works to draw in a diversity of ideas and energies from experts in anthropology, geology, geography, biology, climatology, political science, economics. He is open to brainstorming with almost any sort of expert you could name. When so many scholars are siloed in their academic specialties, Eduardo brings the vitality of multiple perspectives and data sets to bear on the most pressing problems of our time. And as a human being, Edu applies his deep and ever-expanding knowledge of human systems and cultural achievements to understand his own positionality in the world, which makes him a serious threat to colonialism and an authentic activist. This morning, Professor Washul of the University of Virginia talked about the importance of Indigenous research as not simply recording, but of building a future. And I believe that this should be a standard applied to all good research. The topics we choose and the focus of our inquiries help us determine what comes next. When you hear Eduardo Brondizio's talk, I believe you will see that if research can create a future, the future is in good hands.
Thank you. Whoop. Thank you, Anne. Can you hear me? This was kind and embarrassing, as you said. So thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers of this amazing conference, you and Serafin and all the team that has made this possible. It has been really energizing to be here, to welcome all of you to our campus. We're really honored that you're here with us, so thank you. I feel particularly privileged as a non-Indigenous scholar, to have the opportunity to share some reflections on the position of Indigenous issues globally today. I do most of my work in the Amazon. I also do work globally, which I'm going to share today. And this talk, I also feel very privileged that it builds really I think, on the talks that we got from the first keynote yesterday from Miriam Jerez, which was a wonderful introduction, to the global and to the international trajectory of indigenous organizations, and where we are today, particularly at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I'm going to build heavily on that, and I'm going to look at the intersection of that with the emergent global environmental governance, right? And make an argument that you see from the very beginning that those two processes have become intertwined. I also build a lot on the talk from this morning from David Harrison. It was a great talk, and which call attention to this sort of really place-based relationship with nature and the threats, right, that they are facing everywhere. So on those two talks, I bring them, they form kind of a foundation, so to speak and to look at a more global level. What's happening globally with the position of indigenous peoples at the intersection of global environmental change. Before I start, and as we have done different times, I want to have a land acknowledgement on behalf of my department, the Anthropology Department. We wish to acknowledge and honor the Miami, the Delaware, Potawatomi, and Sewanee people, and on whose lands, ancestral homelands, and resources IU was built. And mention about the exhibit. So it's a personal invitation, and there are several colleagues here from the museum. Beatriz, who also co-curated the exhibit with us. These are shots of the exhibit, right, which has the same name of this talk, locally based, globally relevant, and I'll try to make a little bit of the explanation of that. So if you have a chance, if the museum is still open, it would be great to go there. I'll try to bring some elements of the exhibit so you see how it looks there, okay? Well, here's another one of the exhibit, but basically students have a chance to look at different pathways of contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities to nature. And you have sort of this interactive exhibit. Jean-Luc is also here, Kyla maybe, that the museum put together, which is a really nice experience. So if you have a chance, go there. All right, I have 3 points to make, again, building on the 2 previous keynotes, right? The first one is one of what I just said. Like, indigenous struggles at an international level have become, for about 40 years now, completely intertwined with the emergence of global environmental governance, right? And this is a really important point today because some of the same issues that are confronted by indigenous peoples are some of the same dilemmas and issues that were confronted globally to work toward, collective actions on the kinds of problems that we are facing on climate, on biodiversity, and on development. There has been a lot of progress, but also a lot of challenges that remain and some challenges that are becoming, even bigger. The second point that I want to make is one of the, I think, major change that we have had just in the past 10 years, which is recognition and understanding of the actual importance of indigenous land management and stewardship and resource stewardship at the global level. And thus this framing about locally based, globally relevant. Until not long ago, of course, there's research on this topic for a century. But until not long ago, this recognition was mainly based on place-based case studies or illustrative examples. We have a whole different perspective, a whole different picture today about the actual global importance of indigenous lands and indigenous people. So that's the other point. The third point, and these 2 points are interrelated to the first one, is that many of the problems that we face at the global level, and in spite of the advances that we have seen towards the recognition of indigenous rights, the old problems continue and new ones are appearing. So we have, sort of confluence of sort of the pressures that have been pressing indigenous people for centuries, with new pressures that are emerging at the intersection of finding solutions for climate change, for instance, with green technologies and other processes that are shaping now. So indigenous peoples are today both, and that's perhaps the single point of this slide, at the forefront of addressing the global issues that we're facing, but also at the forefront at the most pressing sort of problems that we're facing at the global level. Okay, so I'll try to unpack these 3 points one by one. So first is this history, this convergence that happens at the beginning of the 1980s, as Miriam really nicely said yesterday, in terms of the emergence of indigenous organization internationally. So taking a shot from the exhibit there, which starts with the history, right? I'm going to unpack some of the elements to complement Miriam's excellent sort of description of several events and landmark events that shape the position of indigenous organizations today. So, which was sort of the bottom part. So I just want to highlight some points here. As indigenous international movements start to converge in the 60s and 70s, you start to have awareness and international collaboration around global environmental issues, right? The first landmark here, though not the only one, this is just a synthetic timeline, was the Conference on the Human Environment, the Stockholm 1972, right? When we wake up to the level and scale of global environmental problems more broadly. This is the same time when you start to have an indigenous organization globally starting to formalize a place and to gain recognition at the level of the UN and at the level of other intergovernmental platforms. So as Miriam described yesterday, the 74 Indian Treaty Council, the special working group on indigenous peoples, several processes that led to the formation of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and later to, of course, the Declaration on Indigenous Rights. This is a time when global environmental issues is also converging. So you start to have multilateral environmental agreements that start to transcend borders and to deal with cross-border issues. In 1992, perhaps one of the most fundamental changes that we see, we have Rio 92, which was a follow-up of Stockholm 92. In that particular moment, several instruments that are now at the forefront of this have been created, right? Particularly the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, right? And also the formalization of the UN FCCC, the Climate Change Framework, right, globally. So you start to have this conversion. At the same time as during the 1980s, indigenous movements were already coalescing around environmental issues. And Amazonia was one of the forefronts, but not only, of this movement. So you start to have organization in a way that was, sort of confronting the fast pace of commodity expansion, agrarian expansion, and development programs that were starting to, come to forefront to indigenous lands at that time. Right, so 1980s, you have indigenous organization emerging. You have also, sort of researchers converging along the lines of indigenous collaborators. And you have at the same time the emergence of these global international agreements. Very early on, indigenous peoples had a direct sort of connection to the Convention of Biological Diversity. It takes time. It takes over more than, maybe some would argue a couple of decades for that convergence to happen on the face of climate change, right, which is now taking place. So some sort of landmarks that are important here. The Convention on Biological Diversity becomes, in 1992, becomes, a formal body. You start to have a work program. That work program directly intersects with managing biodiversity and resource on indigenous lands, right? But you don't have a formal framework for the incorporation of indigenous peoples in that convention. And then in a few years, you have the Article 8J, CBG Article 8J. How many of you know that particular platform? Right, so this is one of the most important frameworks for indigenous peoples that offer that entry point already in the 1990s to be part of this global conversation. So this Article 8J basically creates within an international intergovernmental platform a space that is specifically dedicated to indigenous peoples. Here, there's a really interesting process that happened at that time, and today is still, it's coming back and sort of becoming part of an important part of the conversation, which are a series of coalitions that emerge between indigenous peoples and different kinds of rural movements in different contexts, right? For regions like the Amazon, this conversion was very strategic because they are facing the same problems. Traditional communities and indigenous lands were confronted in the same way, with the expansion of cattle ranching, mining, and infrastructure, and so forth. So you start to have convergence, right, that led to different kinds of alliance. At the international level, that led to an alliance that is still today, persists, but is sort of, increasingly contested, so to speak, which is, and you see that in this acronym that is widely used in most international conventions, in most sort of intergovernmental forums, which is IPLC. Have you heard of this acronym? Not many? Okay. Indigenous people and local communities, right? This is like the Article 8J and others created this framework in which you see indigenous people and local communities as part of a broader category. This was really important at the time and for many years because it allowed to create an inclusive umbrella within global environmental governance for a wide and diverse range of groups. For one thing, you have in many countries that are part of the same frameworks, they don't recognize the category of indigenous. So for many countries to be able to negotiate in these platforms, they had to sort of create or accept this category of local communities as a way to sort of be inclusive of groups that otherwise would not be included. So it was a very broad category, and a category that persists today, right? But today is generating a series of debates. There are many, and which is raising a lot of questions about how it's going to advance further. For 20-some years, this category allowed for indigenous peoples and local community organizations to gain increasing space within global platforms, governance platforms. Today, there's quite a bit of disputes about the value of combining these two categories because of differential rights between indigenous peoples and this very broad category of local communities. So it's a very important topic that is happening today, but it has served for many years, and it still serves for many years to be an inclusive category to allow this political space to be open in international forums. Several things happen here. I'm just giving sort of a very overall view of this intersection, right? But most recently, and you see how much this is advancing, particularly in the past few years. Just last month, about a month, ago exactly, the COP16, which is the Convention of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, is, sort of the equivalent to the COP for the climate, had a major step, sort of, if you look on these 2 decades of development. A particular subsidiary body, which is a technical language within this intergovernmental platform that you have a technical body dedicated to, has been created for Article 8J, which I mentioned at the beginning, meaning the article that gives space and recognition in an international convention to indigenous peoples. This is a major step, right? Because it really formalized 30 years of work to have a place on the table and to have a higher voice on the table of these international agreements and conventions. So the process has been slow, but it has become increasingly intertwined at the global level, and I'll show you, next why this has gained so much importance. Yeah, those are well, another thing that is important. Within each one of those conventions today, as Miriam was saying yesterday in her talk, you have now working groups or you have spaces totally dedicated for IPOC, for indigenous groups and local communities. So formally, progressively, you start to have a formal recognition within this global platform. This is the the subsidiary body that was announced just a month ago, you know, in creating this platform for indigenous people. I want to enter a little bit into the mechanics of global governance as it pertains to indigenous peoples. And there's not, you know, one important entry point for that. It's where the money is, where the financing for global environmental governance is. And that has been, you know, the other front that you know, has been really important here. The Global Environmental Facility, how many of you know the Global Environmental Facility? So this is the main financial body of everything we hear about climate change on biodiversity. It's really a central part which is connected to the World Bank that since early 1990s has been the funding source for these initiatives. When you look over time, you know, and of course the proportion of funding going to indigenous organizations has been very small, right? But growing. But what is important here is that if you look at one of their latest reports, which speaks to these broader conventions and these broader communities, it becomes very clear that now there is this recognition is sort of written, right? That we cannot achieve the internationally agreed goals for climate change and for biodiversity and many of the sustainable development goals if you not fully recognize, include, fund, and support indigenous people. This is a significant change to have this written in an international convention and by the main funding source of this convention. When you look over time, and I'll sort of look at how this funding is and what kinds of approaches have been evolved and where we are today, right? If you look at the reports of these conventions and the funding for these conventions, you see some really interesting trends, both that have supported and have actually sort of creating more pressures and impacts on indigenous peoples. So if you look at the kinds of funding and projects that have been done, you know, from the 1990s all the way to 2005 and so, you see a particular pattern. And a pattern that we know very well, and a pattern that indigenous people know very well. Protected areas, right? Designated protected areas, in many cases which led to the displacement of indigenous people, right? In name of biodiversity conservation or other conservation, but it has been the main mode operandus, you know, for achieving some of these goals at that stage. So what you look across projects and across programs is a, you know, very clear pattern of top-down conservation, programs that are designed, right, from the outside and sort of imposed on the inside. Mitigation over prevention. You first create projects, fund projects, then if there are problems, you sort of address those problems. So a very kind of non-anticipatory approach. Indigenous people as just beneficiaries, right, from top-down programs and not defining or participating in the definition of those programs. Lack of distinction between indigenous peoples and other rural communities. And that's one of the problems that this sort of umbrella terminology has created. Flaw alternative livelihoods. This is perhaps one of the most common types of interventions that we have seen in this engagement over time. Great ideas of how do you improve your production system, how do you improve your management, how do you bring new crops that are more nutritious, and so forth and so forth. So a lot of what became known as flawed livelihood alternatives. Lack of consultation, projects imposed from the outside down, you know, usually through national government. Lack of free and informed consent. In participation in decision-making. So this has been the modus operandi, it's still in some place, but has been the modus operandi of this sort of intersection for about 20 years. When you look over time, and then you look the engagement of indigenous organizations, the formalization and the expanding number of indigenous organizations participating in these forums, right? And of course, evidence from the ground, you see significant shifts both in the operation of these platforms and also how projects and financing are operated. So for saying create an indigenous task force, so bringing representatives, you know, to the table in deciding and defining this project. Like for GAF, for the Global Environmental Facility, the IPEG. A major step forward, right, when you create an organization within that to be part of the decision-making and the prioritization of that. Development of principles and guidelines, right, that all projects have to serve, have to follow. So very important there. Engagement with indigenous peoples have become sort of mandatory in implementing these projects. Minimum standards and sort of monitoring of project performance. So we see significant changes and improvement because of the sometimes forceful engagement and participation of indigenous organizations. But nonetheless, we do see improvements. A lot of things remain. I mean, when you look at, sort of evaluation of these reports today, you still see some of the same issues, that are persisting. Funding, it's still a minimal part of the humongous amount of funding that is going for climate and biodiversity. Right? It's improving, but it's still sort of, disproportional, as you see, I'll argue later, to the contributions that they bring. Policies that are still need updating, right, on how to implement, particularly new directions that have come now, in the past 10 years. Tenure continues to be one of the main issues, right, and not addressed by many of these programs, right, that many times because of interface with national government. Capacity building and financing, again. Conservation mechanisms beyond the traditional conservation mechanisms that creates sort of a straitjacket many ways for the types of managements that are done on the ground. And lack of leadership in many of these programs and projects. So we see progress, but we see also, sort of same of the old issues kind of remaining. Now, I'll move to my second point, which is how much we have, how much understanding we have today about the contribution of indigenous peoples globally. As I said at the beginning, this is a very recent phenomenon. Just 10, 15 years ago, while we had an enormous amount of research on this topic, there were very little synthesis. And synthesis that would allow you to see what are the regional and global impact of the practice that you see on the ground. I co-chair a global assessment report, and I remember very well at the beginning, right? Because one of the things that we did was to do a systematic approach to include the contributions and the pressures on indigenous peoples systematically across an entire assessment. And I remember hearing very well, many comments like, well, but these are just case studies. These are just localized contributions. These are sort of, very specific places that do not have a place or a scale at the global level. And what we learned by summarizing, by sort of working with indigenous organizations and kind of bringing together research from many areas was a completely different view. Now, there's a lot of change that happens that has led to this kind of, to the evolution of research on the contributions of indigenous peoples. First, a change in research and science, right? We have 100 years of research that is focused on appropriating indigenous knowledge, or very instrumentalist in terms of looking for things, that can be transferred everywhere. Very utilitarian focused research, and it's still today for many years. But this has changed significantly too over time. So nowadays, when you look at these platforms, you look at frameworks, to look at the intersection of indigenous management and stewardship with nature, you see much broader frameworks, as I mentioned, like that gives attention to worldview, that gives a lot more attention to values, that gives more attention to ontologies, and attention to history, that underline this direct contribution on the management of nature. So it's moving from a very utilitarian focus, to a more inclusive and holistic focus that gives, a much better picture of governance. Indigenous institutions, indigenous organizations, indigenous institutions that are doing research have expanded in every part of the world, right? So you have capacity today and collaboration with researchers that are allow communities themselves and indigenous scholars to do this research, to take the lead on this research. We see that, for instance, in in global assessments or regional assessments or national assessment like it's happening in the US and North America like now, the North American Biodiversity and Climate Change Assessment. Before, and in the global assessment, for instance, we had a significant difficulty in getting indigenous scholars and practitioners as authors. They're consultants, they're sort of participating in different ways, but not as authors of those assessments. 10 years ago, this would be impossible because all the nomination of authors are done by countries and sort of in the very formal process. Today, many of these assessments have a critical mass of indigenous scholars that are working in this. So significant changes have been happening for us to get this different picture that we have today about the contribution of indigenous peoples at the global level. Here are 3 examples, interesting. These are important changes that happen within the research community in that sort of relates to that. The Declaration of Barbados. I don't know if, I'm not sure whether Miriam mentioned yesterday, 1971. It's a really interesting declaration because it's basically a reckoning of anthropologists, right? Repositioning anthropologists, in the collaboration with indigenous peoples in 1971, and at the same time making a case, right, for the problems and the impact of development that was scaling up at that time on indigenous peoples. But it reshaped the way anthropology worked with indigenous peoples in that sense. You have the Declaration of Belém in 1988. Was quite important because it positioned indigenous knowledge. It was done in the Amazon. It was an international conference on ethnobiology. It repositioned indigenous knowledge as alternative to the kind of development that was destroying the Amazon. So sort of reframing knowledge in a much bigger context, in a much bigger conversation with development, as did the Belém Plus 30. So these are kind of events that start to mark a change in the research community and the way we interact and collaborate with indigenous peoples. And it has been quite a process. So if you look at some of the first kind of analysis of the contributions of indigenous people to environmental issues, regionally or globally, it started in the 1990s. But you see a fast projection of these efforts over time. And today, as I said, a lot of these efforts are being led by indigenous scholars and indigenous organizations. This is one example, the 2 local biodiverse outlooks, which support the exhibit that Ian mentioned here. These are compilations of cases written by and organized by indigenous organizations. What they do is that they address and give examples and local examples of how indigenous peoples are contributing to each of the targets of the global agreement on biodiversity, the global biodiversity framework. So this, it repositioned indigenous organizations as sort of main players in that space. As I said, very different conceptualization of nature that emerged from this closer collaboration and closer participation of indigenous organizations and scholars in this international forum. So the frameworks that are used today to analyze those relationships, and this is the framework that guided the entire global assessment report on biodiversity and ecosystem service, they are inclusive of a wide range of values and worldviews, right? And therefore, they have to look for evidence to sort of talk about these issues in a much more inclusive way. Now, one of the main changes, and perhaps one of the most important sort of shifts, happened very recently in 2018 in an effort that a number of people, including myself, got to create a first global map of indigenous lands. There was not such a map, and this is still incomplete, of indigenous lands just 6 years ago, right? When we were able to do this map, to publish this map, then we had a completely conversation around the table when it comes to global environmental governance, right? From a thinking process that would position indigenous areas and indigenous groups as localized and dispersed, this map showed that at least a quarter, more than a quarter of the Earth's surface terrestrial surface is managed and held in rights by indigenous peoples. It completely changed sort of the perspective that we have about the importance, and it helps to explain why indigenous people have become intricate to the current agenda on climate change and the current agenda on biodiversity, right? Any policy that you look that have been agreed on the most recent global environmental framework, the 2030 Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, if you look at the 22 targets in that framework, you're gonna find that most of them intersect, depend on, or need to build upon, right, indigenous people's lands and management and knowledge. So today we have a very different perspective, a very different image of what the place of indigenous people in these global challenges. It is also allowing, for a completely different understanding to actually, unpack those different contributions. These are only few examples of the kinds of knowledge that we have today that reposition this conversation, right, that are taking place at the global level. Again, biodiversity and climate and much of, many other international treaties. So 28% of the land surface managed or held in rights by indigenous peoples. This is not complete, for one thing, because for many areas we don't have maps or groups are not recognized and therefore cannot be, assessed. One of the studies that 32%, if you include customary lands that are not formally demarcated, right, as indigenous lands. About 40% of the globe protected areas overlap with indigenous areas, right? So the most important instrument that has been put in place for protection of biodiversity and water highly depend on the management of indigenous peoples, right? And that includes for many watersheds that are entirely in supply cities and supply metropolitan areas, but that are entirely within indigenous areas. Most of the land in good ecological condition, right? And by measures of, different measures of biodiversity variables are within indigenous lands. So some of the most precious ecosystems, the most sort of least disturbed ecosystems or best managed ecosystems are in indigenous lands. So key biodiversity areas. 65% of indigenous lands have zero to low human modification, meaning deforestation, right? Comparing to other lands. So you can imagine the importance of that, for instance, for carbon and other things. 91% in moderate to good ecological conditions. And key to the provisioning of many of the ecosystem service that people depend elsewhere, particularly in urban areas. So today we have a picture that 10 years ago it was not possible. And therefore, it's contributing to change, hopefully, that their position in global environmental governance. These are, just to mention, how we are looking into these contributions. These are the 6 we call pathways of contributions that the exhibit that we mentioned is organized. So we have, land and water management, conservation and restoration, assessment and monitoring, resistance movements, environmental governance, and relationship to nature. Each one of those are sort of a way of organizing a variety of contributions, right, across the 6 pathways. So if you look at the previous, if you look at the previous biodiversity agreement, the International Biodiversity Agreement, which was between 2011 and 2020, the Aichi biodiversity targets, the contributions of indigenous people have been major. So marine and freshwater ecosystems in terms of restoration and conservation, agrobiodiversity, invasive species and controlling invasive species or eradicating invasive species, protection of protected areas, protection and management of vulnerable species, creation of new research protocols and research procedures, and monitoring systems for biodiversity. So you look back in the previous agreements, you look forward, you see them, impossible to disentangle with the contribution of indigenous people. Now, what's the other side of it? The other side is that we have all this recognition. We now have a good understanding, and I guess better tools for supporting indigenous people's governance. On the other side, these are the areas and the populations that are really at the forefront of the main problems driving climate change, of the main problems driving biodiversity loss, and and water and other issues. This hasn't changed, and that's one of the really important issues that I think we need to discuss. There are many mechanisms that have been put in place and financed and so forth to support indigenous management, but very little to support the pressures that are coming from the outside. The underlying causes of change hasn't been addressed, as we all know when we talk about climate change and so forth. So it creates the situation where, the expectation is increasing, the responsibility is increasing for managing and for taking care of such precious, sort of wealth that we all share, at the same time as the pressures are also increasing. And many of these pressures are now coming from the very environmental conventions that, are imbricated with indigenous people. So when you look at carbon projects and where they're put in place and their consequence, when you look at green transition in energy and what's happening to mining rare metals and several other infrastructure, and so on and so on, you're going to see indigenous peoples right at the forefront of these issues. And this is still sort of, the really kind of a challenge that is not faced. Now, if you look on the other side of it, right, we're talking about also the most vulnerable population globally. So if on the one hand, you have that picture of, the stewards of global nature that we now have a good sense of. On the other hand, we have the sort of super vulnerable populations that are put in, this position. So most countries have not recognized the ILO Convention, right, and cannot be sort of, abide to that. Highest poverty rates, although there's a big problem here, there's no good poverty measure or well-being measure that is applicable, right, to the diversity of indigenous populations on the ground. Informal jobs is predominant, in many areas. I'm not showing this here, but we did an analysis of, just last year, of employment in agriculture, and that means, food like agriculture, fishing, forest, wild species harvesting, a number of other things, in which is the most important source of employment for most indigenous people, right? And the projected loss in jobs in agriculture for the next, until 2030, is much faster than what happened between 1990 and today. So there's about 120 million jobs that will be going to be lost in food production during the next 6 years, right? A significant part of these jobs are jobs that otherwise, would be jobs among in indigenous areas too, right? There are many reasons for that that we can talk about, and pros and cons, and pollution exposure and so forth. So I'm going to show some data on this that we have compiled. Like in the global assessment, we did a compilation of over 500 indicators taken from case studies and publications, local indicators that describe the conditions of ecosystems or the problems that ecosystems are faced. 72% of those indicators, the top ones have to do with, indicators related to biomes or ecosystems. And the bottom one with particular biodiversity variables like community composition, ecosystem functioning, and so forth, so forth. 72% of those indicators are in decline, right? So you see a lot of that pressure coming from the outside and, sort of affecting significantly the environment in indigenous areas. When you look at the main drivers of change in indigenous areas, this is an analysis that we look, internally, only indigenous areas. You see overall, but it varies from region to region. But the two sort of or the trio of drivers here are very clear. Direct exploitation and extraction of resource, agriculture expansion, and increasingly climate change, right? So these are kind of the main drivers that are today facing that. Global analysis that are now, we can do global analysis of these threats, and the picture that emerges of this global analysis is equally, sort of starking. 60% of indigenous areas are surrounded, and I'll show an example here, by these kinds of pressures, right? And the kinds of governance that are in place are limited to deal with the scale of these pressures and the way those pressures play down. Similar with pollution. We did a review of pollution affecting indigenous peoples, and in many regions, they are, again, at the forefront of the worst sort of situation of environmental pollution, being of mercury, like in the Amazon, or all sorts of mining pollutions and other kinds of agrochemical pollutions and so forth. So it varies regionally, but in some regions, sort of indigenous peoples are taking the blunt of the kinds of pollution. For some indigenous areas in Brazil, the level of contamination of mercury is basically 100%, right? And this is a particular case where the population has actually, there are lots of mining areas within Munduruku. So here's the situation. I mean, what's happened is that we have a lot of progress in recognition of indigenous lands, recognition of their contributions, creation and demarcation of indigenous lands. In the Amazon, it's a great example. From 1990 to today, we have about 25% of the Amazon demarcated in indigenous lands. It's not complete, but it's a huge, huge improvement. What's happening is that because of these other pressures, these lands are becoming what we call islands of cultural and biological diversity, right? Surrounded by agro-industrial and other forms of land use. That poses a completely different challenge for governance, right? This was done with the basis of what I'll call single-level governance. You have governance that is area-based, and indigenous peoples do a great job in maintaining the governance of their territories. What they cannot do is to take care of the governance outside of those territories, but they feel the impact in the same way. So you get this area here, which is the Xingu National Park, with about 23 ethnicity, and it's cut by the Xingu watershed, right? It's super well preserved inside the park. Now, the problems are coming from the outside. The pollution comes through the river. The fire comes from the outside. So a system of governance that has been very effective in protecting the borders and guaranteeing sort of the resource in terms of the park is now almost being undermined by what's happening around them, and there's not a governance framework that allows to deal with that problem, which is at a higher scale. Now, there's another problem here, which is who pays the costs and who gains the benefits. This may not be easy to do, but the idea here is that we're studying a lot of different initiatives in the Amazon, looking at solutions for local problems with local economic alternatives, like improved markets for forest products, for sort of locally grown products, and so forth. So what we see is that the responsibility of indigenous people in conserving their areas has increased. There's a lot on their back in terms of protecting against deforestation, against mining, managing the environment, and so forth, so forth. So there's a lot of ecological contributions that are coming from these efforts, right? Indigenous in the Amazon, for instance, but that you'll see from if you remember the global map of indigenous lands, for most of these regions, indigenous peoples are protecting land that are benefiting everyone around it, benefiting urban areas that, sort of downstreams and so forth. Now, the ecological returns are great. Now, the economic alternatives for indigenous groups are not at the same level. So, what we are hearing over and over and over again as we work with cooperatives, with, efforts that are trying to bring value to promote local economies that are based on knowledge and biodiversity, is that the bottom line does not add up. They're always in disadvantage in global markets in which you conserve the areas, produce products sustainably, right? And you're cheated by the market. And what it's creating is a huge disincentives, right, for investing on that, and it's taking the opportunities for the youth to build upon those economies and to sort of maintain and empower and sort of invest in their own communities, like we saw this morning. Right? You have a lot of pressures for youth moving away, in part because, you know, all the economics alternatives that have been tried and that are in place to support locally, they are in disadvantage when it comes to market access and so forth and so forth. So you have lots of problems that are creating this disbalance. Huge responsibility, enormous contribution in protecting vast areas that everybody benefits, but the economics of it is sort of, you know, unfair. And that's creating these incentives that youth have to leave those areas to seek alternatives elsewhere. Here's an example, a recent dissertation, but a problem that we find, you know, almost everywhere we work. We have wonderful, you know, initiatives, examples to create new products, to bring products that are locally produced, you know, products that comes from well-managed forests, ecosystems, and rivers, you know, and really creating products that are amazing. At the same time, with this sort of very difficult kind of economic equation that, you know, makes them largely non-profitable in many ways. On the other hand, on the same reservation, you have communities that have decided to pair with the mining companies because of the kinds of the, you know, the agreements that are made and the you know, fast rent that is done, you know, with money transfer. So a lot of communities are in this kind of situation where they cannot manage to successfully achieve an economy, you know, with their production systems, at the same time being bombarded by these kinds of pressures that are competing at the local level. So some fine, you know, sort of final considerations here. Major advances, as we saw yesterday from Miriam's talk, and as we hopefully saw some of it today in terms of their kind of, you know, being part of a global environmental governance and institutions, lots of advances, lots of things to celebrate. But it's still a lot to be implemented. A lot of those processes are not consolidated in practice. You have a lot of saying, less of doing. And you have kind of new challenge today. There, you know, just for biodiversity, there's 200 billion promised by 2030. For climate, the amount is even bigger. That's going to the global environmental facility, as I said, the, you know, green climate fund, and to other funds, you know, that are supposed to support these areas. This, you know, it sort of has created a lot of challenges. It creates a lot of opportunities, of course, because there are, you know, ways in which these funds can be productively done, but you have a lot of other challenges. First, you have a lot of intermediaries that are knocking on the doors of indigenous areas and local communities, selling carbon credits, selling biodiversity credits, you know, doing contracts, you know, for fast kind of money that, you know, tie communities in contracts that they don't even understand. You have a lot of carbon cowboys out there, right? And biodiversity cowboys out there. So lots of opportunities, but it's still, you know, quite a distance between translating these funds into funds in which, you know, sort of that are decided and that actually address the needs of communities on the ground vis-a-vis the needs that are defined from the outside, right? Being that of increasing carbon or protecting a particular species. As I said before, very little attention to addressing the underlying causes of pressures, problems, and environmental degradation. We've been able to address, in some ways, what we call the direct drivers, the things that really make a change. You know, the guy who comes in the forest, the mining who comes and open a pit, right? The pollution that may come from somewhere. There's some success in addressing these direct drivers of change, but not the indirect drivers. The financial systems that funnel money to these areas, the policies that create, you know, incentives and encouragement for different kinds of land use. The subsidies, they're incredibly perverse and that continue to incentivize the kinds of environmental degradation that are surrounding indigenous lands. And more recently, the fast spread of green colonialism. I mean, you look at mining for rare metals, and you know, there's a mine being found every day somewhere in indigenous lands, right? You have projects, different kinds of projects for green energy, and now for, you know, hydrocarbon and green hydrocarbon that overlap directly with indigenous lands. There's a lot of new, you know, and alternative solutions to climate change that may have the counter effect as we have seen for previous alternatives. So it's a very double bind here situation where, you know, indigenous peoples are recognized as at the, you know, sort of forefront of this efforts, at the same time as, you know, maybe at the forefront of confronting the problems, that are the solutions or the solutionism that is emerging on this. And finally, you know, the way climate shocks are accelerating. In this, I bring, you know, my particular perspective from the Amazon. The past 5 years have been completely off the chart and completely, you know, so no one has expected the kind of extreme shocks that are taking place in the region. In, you know, this year and last year, drought and fires at a scale that is unimaginable. We have entire large tributaries of the Amazon that are not even passable anymore. Now, the governance systems that have been put in place, you know, particular area-based governance systems, are not enough to deal with these problems, right? They, you know, because these problems are at a higher scale or need to be managed at a much higher scale or at the entire watershed scale, right, to be minimized. And at the same time, we have a very polarized landscape with actors being fed through polarization in which indigenous peoples, you know, become sort of a counter to the development narratives that are out there. So you do not have that kind of environment that, you know, is conducive for coordinating activities that need to be coordinated at a high scale. So we are, you know, in a situation of shock and in a situation, you know, that is fractured collective action that is posing many different kinds. So this is one of the things that we need to rethink that in many ways, not only in terms of the policy, but how the narrative can create new bridges to deal with problems that are beyond specific areas or specific groups. And therefore, yeah, I mean, sort of thinking about governance in a more integrated way. This is my message. I hope it was okay. And we can talk about it. I'll be glad to take questions. I can show you the exhibit if you like. I'll just show you slides here. You can see encourage you to go there. This is a different version of the global map that we produced. And we did it in a way that the sites that we show in the exhibit would be apparent, but also to the center, the kind of European center world map that we tend to see, right? And you see, you know, what's the scale of indigenous lands globally, I think, in a whole different way. Yeah.
I think on one of the slides, my name is Anouk. I'm Inupiaq from Alaska, and I noticed you had a slide related to the Inuit Circumpolar Council and either wetland, fish, or wildlife management. And I was hoping you could provide more details on that partnership and why that was beneficial.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I put it there because it's one of the international political arenas where specific, you know, sort of indigenous organizations and groups have a place at the table and are discussing policy along with, at least to some extent, along with nation states. So that was the point that, you know, sort of is similar. It's used as an example by many other organizations where, you know, we want to have at least close to that level of political, you know, sort of participation as you have in the circumpolar region. So that's part of that because it represents, you know, it's an example where, nation states and organized indigenous organizations at least have, a more similar kind of place on the table. Yeah.
One of the topics that was highlighted was assessment, and I'm just curious if the ICC was assessing, and like what were they assessing, and how did they assess?
Yeah.
And what was the outcome?
Yeah. So I don't know the details. I know one assessment which is on food security and food sovereignty that they have done. But the point there is that, they have developed the capacity to do and to produce environmental knowledge and to monitor environmental knowledge on their own terms. And that is what I want to highlight. They have been instrumentalized to actually create those assessments, create the narrative, show how do they see, sort of the system functioning, and use those assessments with the same legitimacy as a scientific assessment. So I think it's a great example because sort of it's produced from within at very high quality, and showing their own perspective. So it's great to see those assessments, I think.
I think we all loved your map. I saw so many phones raised up to get but and I personally was happy because usually Africa and Asia get left off of indigenous land maps. But could you tell a little bit more about how you got this data and what has been the political or other reactions to it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are some limitations here. We got data that is publicly available. All the lists of data is also publicly available, so you can see every list of maps. So we basically collect on a country base, all the indigenous maps that are kind of publicly available or recognized. And we start with a group of experts kind of evaluating each one of them and compiling into, a global map of indigenous areas. That leaves a lot of areas outside, areas that have customary, rights are hardly taken. I mean, there's some of that, which are pastoral lands, in Africa in particular, of course, have customary lands, but in many other cases, that was not possible. There are quite a bit of reactions to it. It's quite interesting. I mean, some countries would not even accept, indigenous land as a category, and yeah, plain of that. So they won't accept. The one example, for instance. In other areas, they would classify differently, like, ethnic lands or some other kind of minority ethnic group and so forth. Now, we had, for instance, when we did the global assessment, we want to publish this map as part of the global assessment, right, as a map. And some countries interfere and said they would not approve the assessment if the map was there. They would allow the data to be there, right? So we had some figures about it or some graphs about it, but they would not allow a map to be presented showing their borders having indigenous lands. So, yeah. On the other hand, it was an interesting, so for instance, China, for instance, they would block, even Japan and other countries, they would block that. So it is a challenging issue still. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for an extremely detailed and intellectually overwhelming presentation. I find that all these, there's just a massive confluence of complicated factors that you've presented. And on one hand, it's inspiring, on the other hand, it's a little bit
Overwhelming.
Debilitating, or perhaps. Your final of the 3 points was that these the underlying drivers of social and environmental pressures on indigenous peoples is not well understood, and they're not being well addressed. Yeah. I was wondering what your recommendations are for those for this issue, this problem. What is the way forward? How do we better understand these underlying drivers and address them if that is the current gap?
Yeah. I mean, what are underlying drivers in this sense? I think the first one is values, societal values, right? And what we think as, economic development, for instance, and the policy that we put behind it. So some of the issues have to do with narrative. The narratives that we create that kind of promote the kinds of economies and the kinds of, sort of commodity production that we see today, right? So you have that very fundamental value of recognizing the importance of these areas, recognizing the importance of stewardship, right? And put that at the same level as you put all these other commodity economies, right? That always take front center. So there's a narrative issue that is underlying there that we haven't changed in many regions at least, right? And have exacerbated in other regions, so to speak. To that, there's another side to that, which is how do we recognize the value of these contributions? And we do not have measures or even good data to do that, right? So for instance, how do you put a value in protecting a watershed that feeds a metropolitan area, right? Or conserving vast areas of floodplain that guarantees the stock of fish for a large group of people, right? We do not have good alternatives to bring those values to bear with the values that we tend to use to guide development policies and so forth, the GDP and the other things that are extremely narrow. So there's still a lot of invisibility to quantify these contributions. I'll give another example. Management and production of food from wild species is a huge global economy, right? There's 1 billion people involved with this. We don't have the economic value of this. We don't know how to say, well, this is a major contribution to regional economic development. We see that in the Amazon, the areas that I worked the entire time. You have, producers in agroforestry, in forest management, in community-based management of fisheries that are gearing the entire regional economy. It's still statistically totally invisible, right? So how can we compare a policy that supports further expansion of soybean, right, with to say, well, these contributions here are equally or higher than the contributions that are there. So you have that kind of underlying factors that we haven't addressed. It is a matter of, how do we do accounting and, the narratives there. But you have others like the kinds of subsidies and where subsidies are oriented today. They facilitated these kinds of sustainable activities, right? You have a subsidy machine, that is geared and support that. So changing the subsidies. Compliance and regulations, right? I mean, we get a lot of illegally produced fish, wood, minerals, and food through our markets here. But they come from illegal networks, right? That are not monitored and many kind incentivized. And the list goes on. So there's a lot of underlying features, but what I want to highlight here, these are, not just the, the major policy decisions that we see, it's the narrative and how we see, how do we understand these contributions as well. So.
Thank you. Just want to add something more. As you recognize,
I saw her hand there. Yeah.
As you recognize the importance that other things are missing, is the consequences of some indigenous peoples who are leaders and defending the territories who now are killed, and that data is invisibilized. So the indigenous right and territorial defenders are killed. And as you find the data for the territories, the indigenous peoples in each country has their own data, how many of them and when, etc.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that. I should have highlighted that. The number of killings of indigenous leaders is increasing. I think Brazil actually beat, either first or second in record this year, right? Besides that, as well, exactly, environmentalists too. The other thing that I didn't highlight as much, and maybe because it was sort of, it's something that concerns very much with the Amazon today, the level of organized crime has expanded to a level and have now sort of embroiled with these other industries. So when you look at land grabbing, when you look at mining, when you look at fishing, when you look at logging, these are now part of large organized crime networks of commercialization, right? It has become one of the main concerns for local communities, indigenous and rural communities in places like the Amazon. So yeah, I mean, the pressure on all fronts.
Thank you again, like everybody else, your presentation. I was just wondering if you could maybe speak to, and this is like sort of looking into the future, because as I listened to you and also answering some of the questions, the question of, it seems to me the coloniality of it all is sort of bending indigenous people's contributions, and in some ways, how instead of just scaling up, you know, how most people, it's also very local and the language that they use is very localized. But when you get into these global scales, in many ways, it's more like for it to be acceptable, indigenous people have to use the sort of colonial language, if you will. So I was just wondering if you could speak to, in some ways, how to facilitate and open and hold space for indigenous people's knowledge systems and language systems.
Yeah.
Because language, not just as, you know, you and I talking, but really sort of as a cosmology of how to do this rather than trying to figure out how do you fit into this, you know, basically without it being teleological, but it's really more like trying to get indigenous people to sort of speak to this kind of colonizing language. Thank you.
Yeah, no, this is a fantastic point. One that Beatriz is studying very closely. She's looking into indigenous representation in international governance. I mean, as you said, I think the mechanisms that are in place do not facilitate, you know, the kind of diversity and perspectives that you have on the ground. They are very aggregated at a very large level, you know, and tend to be accessible to larger organizations, right, that do not necessarily represent well different regions. I think that's, I mean, I don't have a specific answer, but to say that, for instance, the new mechanism that has been created for the Convention on Biological Diversity should tackle these issues up front. How do you bring representation from local to global scale, right, while maintaining respect to that diversity? I don't think we have good mechanisms today, in part because we have a gap between international mechanisms that are opening because of necessity in the climate and biodiversity. So you have this opening, and the national mechanisms where you lack this opening. So there's a gap between representations that are kind of scaffolding or building up, you know, to really represent issues and you know, from different regions. But I think there's this gap. It's a gap that I think regions and at the national level, it's where, you know, you're going to find that intermediate, you know, between global platforms and global meetings with a language that, you know, kind of there's a particular dialect that is spoken very selective, very excludent, right? I mean, there's a lot of other problems in the representation on the ground. I think, yeah, exactly, many building mechanisms that create that kind of, you know, sort of different tiers of representation is still lacking and still needed.
Thank you very much. Okay, last question. It's actually a comment maybe to respond, but I would like to thank you for your presentation and compliment what I already mentioned and on Monday? No, Friday, sorry. In the issue of representation, I think at least it is very difficult to say who is the representative. At least the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, when it was established, it was kind of negotiated with member states that representatives of the 7 sociocultural regions would have a voice, a seat within this mechanism. And somehow this has been replicated under the UN FCCC, and now in the CBD Convention, the subsidiary body that was just adopted. However, unfortunately, as our friend here pointed out, indigenous peoples still trying to please member states, because the UN is a house, is the home of member states. So they need to figure out how to navigate in that kind of a structure. But again, it is still dangerous, as you pointed out, that this confliction of indigenous peoples and local communities, for example, years ago when it was established, it was, you know, an understanding of the solidarity, but nowadays, little by little, it's causing some kind of troubles. So this is a discussion that needs to be done among indigenous peoples, and I believe it is happening. And also the leaderships, also it's a little bit different, because the leaderships that is in the grassroots levels, at community level, regional levels, at least in my region, is very well organized. But in other regions, it's different. For example, right now, we just advertised the call for the membership of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for next year, 26 to 29. And here, for example, is a clear example on how the call, it says, it should be done through regional conversations, meetings among different indigenous peoples organizations. We would like to have one single person that is coming, you know, nominated by the entire region. The indigenous peoples from Asia, for example, they are a very good example, or even the Arctic, they have a good example. They have their own processes, and they choose and elect one person that should be presented to be appointed in this body. But this is not happening in other regions. And then also this is used by member states, because if you have, for this call, let's say for my region, 7, 10 people, of course member states who is going to appoint that particular person probably is not going to choose the one that represents the indigenous people's organizations, or the one who was elected in these regional meetings. And then maybe it will choose a person that was nominated by someone else and then appointed, and then becomes the danger. So that's why it's really important that you guys, I think most of you are from the academia also, that you can please, in your narratives, try to discuss about these issues, try to challenge the system that exists right now with member states, because many, when they want to say something or to adopt something in their resolutions, they are asking for background notes, resources, where it is. The Permanent Forum has recommendations, and that's a very good value, but they are asking for more. So that's why it's really important that your students, please go back and check this recommendations database, and if they are thinking in writing about something, please try to respond on that, because really that's going to support the cause of indigenous peoples at local level, but also internationally. That was it. Thank you for taking so long. Thank you.
No, thank you. Yeah. And that's a very concrete, I think, step, right? Well, thank you so much. Thank you.